Imagine this. You're driving down a quiet road, the kind where the only sounds are the hum of the engine and the soft melody of your favorite song playing in the background. You're relaxed at ease. Life's good. Until out of nowhere something happens. Something that makes you question everything you know about fairness, justice, and even the system you trust. Sounds intriguing, right? Well, buckle up, because what happens next will leave you speechless. And trust me, it's a twist you didn't see coming. Before we dive into this, let me ask you, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it in your world? Drop a comment and let us know. Stay tuned, because the story you're about to hear is much more than just a traffic stop. It's a journey that will challenge the way you view Power Race and what happens when someone refuses to stay silent. So sit back, relax, but don't get too comfortable. This ride is about to get intense. This is where we begin. The quiet road, the steady beat of Sam Cooke, the peaceful drive home for James Franklin, a 66-year-old man who today is simply returning from a family weekend in Hattiesburg. For him, it's just another trip. But out there on that long stretch of highway, there's something lurking, waiting to catch him in its crosshairs. A road that should have been just a road, but it's not. Not anymore. He's calm, he's steady, he's confident, like he always is, because, well, James has been through more than most. This isn't his first run-in with the law, and he knows the drill. He's been taught how to carry himself. Respect the law, respect others. He does everything by the book, always. But the moment he sees that cruiser, a sheriff's car tucked behind a line of trees, something shifts. At first, he brushes it off. After all, he hasn't done anything wrong. No speeding, no erratic driving, no broken lights. Everything's clean, no big deal. Or so he thinks. But as soon as he passes, the cruiser pulls out. No sirens, no flashing lights, just a car tailing his every move. James takes a slow breath. He knows this game all too well. He shifts the gear into neutral, taps the steering wheel once, twice, and for a second the music fades into the background of his mind. He lowers the volume, his fingers steady as ever. In his gut, though, there's something familiar stirring, that feeling you get when you know a storm is coming, but you don't know when it'll hit. And then the blue and red lights flash in his rearview mirror. Stay calm, he tells himself. With a practiced hand, he signals, pulling the car slowly to the shoulder. Gravel crunches under his tires as he comes to a stop. He shifts into park places, both hands on the wheel, and waits. This isn't the first time this has happened, and sadly, it likely won't be the last. He's been stopped more times than he cares to count. But this one. Something feels different. Out steps Officer Harold Manson. A man with an agenda. A man who doesn't yet realize that he's about to make one of the biggest mistakes of his career. "Good afternoon, Officer James," says, his voice smooth, almost too calm. It's a tone that demands respect, something James has mastered over a lifetime. But Manson is already sizing him up, the way he's dressed, the car he's driving. Something doesn't sit right with him. Manson eyes James with disdain and snaps, "License and registration." Sure. What happens next? Well, that's where the story takes a turn. James remains cool, calm, and collected, but he knows that this encounter is not what it seems. And soon he'll realize just how deep the rabbit hole goes. So stay with us, because everything is about to change, and you won't believe where this journey will take you. James Franklin, the 66-year-old man and with silver hair and sharp, observant eyes, sat behind the wheel of his SUV. His face was calm, almost unnervingly, so as he drove down a quiet stretch of highway. Today, like most days, he had no reason to rush. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was anymore. The weight of his years, his experiences had taught him patience, and it showed. He was a man who had lived through far more than most could imagine, and somehow he'd come out the other side stronger, but always a little wearier. James had just spent a long, much-needed weekend with his daughter and grandchildren in Hattiesburg. The smell of homemade gumbo still lingered in his mind, the laughter of his grandchildren echoing in his ears. It was one of those rare weekends where he felt truly at peace. Just for a moment, he could forget about the weight of the world and focus on what really mattered: family, food, and love. He had told his favorite stories, shared moments with his kids he hadn't had the chance to in weeks, and allowed himself to truly laugh. The kind of deep, soulful laughter that came with the comfort of being surrounded by loved ones. But now, as the familiar roads rolled beneath him, the solitude of the drive felt comforting. The soft hum of the road was the perfect backdrop. The only sound accompanying him was the soulful voice of Aretha Franklin crooning softly from the stereo. James didn't feel any rush, no urgency in his journey back home. It was just him and the open road. No traffic, no distractions, just a peaceful ride under the warm sun. But even in these tranquil moments, something was about to change. James didn't know it yet, but his life, his entire perspective was about to be flipped upside down. This moment, this mundane drive home, would lead him into a confrontation that would test his every ounce of strength, his resilience, and his understanding of justice. And what was even more shocking, this moment wasn't just going to affect him, it would affect everyone who stood by him and witnessed to his courage. The small, unsuspecting act of simply driving home would turn into a battle against an entire system. Charu. Before this moment, James had long come to terms with the realities of his life. As a black man in America, he had learned early on that the world didn't always view him through the same lens. It viewed others, and he had learned to live with that, to adapt, to navigate through the subtle and not so subtle biases that were thrown his way. He had never backed down from a fight, not in his youth, and certainly not now in his older years. Through the decades, James had experienced everything from casual prejudice to outright hostility. The encounters with law enforcement, all too familiar. He had been stopped on the road more times than he could count simply for driving, while black a reality far too common for men like him, and every time it happened, he did the same thing. He complied, kept his head down, stayed calm, and went about his business. That was how he survived. That was how he made it this far. But today he wasn't just another black man pulled over by a cop. He wasn't just going to comply, Sarah Wilton. As James continued driving, he noticed the sheriff's car a few miles back, tucked behind a tree line, almost hidden in the shade. It didn't seem unusual at first. Maybe it was a routine stop for someone else, or maybe the officer was just parked there for a break. But the moment James passed, he saw the lights flicker on. No sirens, no flashing, just the lights. And then the car pulled out quickly, closely tailing him. For a brief second, he thought he might have imagined it, but when he checked his rearview mirror again, the lights were brighter now. The cruiser was still behind him, gaining ground. James slowed the music, his fingers tapping on the steering wheel 1, 2, 3 times just to steady his nerves. It was a familiar feeling when he'd encountered before. He wasn't in a rush, but he knew what came next. Tie, the calm, stoic man behind the wheel, knew exactly how to act in these situations. Keep calm, comply, and hope that it ended quickly. But deep down, he knew this wasn't going to be like the others. Something was different. This time, he wasn't just going to be a passive participant in the system that had long discriminated against him. As he slowed to pull over, he felt a strange sense of déjà vu. His hands were steady on the wheel, but the pit in his stomach told him something was off. What was supposed to be an uneventful drive home had now turned into something far darker. And what James didn't yet realize, what he couldn't yet know, was that this was just the beginning of a storm that was going to shatter the illusions of many, including himself. Officer David Carter stepped out of the cruiser, a man who was just starting his career in law enforcement, but already wore the weight of his own biases. He walked up to James' SUV with a swagger eyes, scanning the vehicle, sizing up the man behind the wheel, as if he had already made up his mind. The interaction began innocently enough. "License and registration, please," Carter barked. But the way he said it, the undertone of authority that bled through his words, told James everything he needed to know. He wasn't dealing with just any officer. This man had made an assumption before even saying a word. James handed over the documents slowly, deliberately, making sure his movements were clear, visible. No sudden actions, no reason to give this officer any excuse to escalate the situation. But Officer Carter wasn't interested in routine. He wasn't interested in following procedure. He was looking for something, anything that would justify his preconceived judgment. Sure. The tension in the air grew. Carter stepped back with a deliberate sneer, his eyes narrowing as he scanned James. And then the questions started, pointed, loaded, and unnecessary. "Is this your car? You always drive something like this?" he asked, his tone dripping with judgment. James didn't respond. The question didn't deserve an answer. The encounter escalated quickly. What started as a simple traffic stop was now a battle of wills. Carter, feeling his power slip away, demanded that James get out of the car. He tried to assert his authority, but James wasn't having it. He wasn't just another black man who would bow his head in submission. The next moments would set everything in motion. Stay tuned, because what happens next is not just about a man and a police officer. It's about a system designed to break people like James Franklin. It's about standing up to injustice, no matter the cost. But don't worry, the fight is only beginning. And James Franklin, he's not going down without a fight. A few miles down the road, the quiet routine of James Franklin's drive took an unexpected turn. He had been lost in thought, the soft hum of the road beneath him, and the soulful voice of Aretha Franklin in the background, comforting him like an old friend. The drive was smooth, uneventful, but that peace didn't last long. From the corner of his eye, he spotted a sheriff's patrol car parked discreetly behind a line of trees. At first, it didn't seem out of the ordinary. Just another cop car pulled over for a break or monitoring traffic. But the moment he passed, the vehicle sprang to life, quickly pulling out onto the road behind him. There were no flashing lights, no sirens, just the sound of an engine revving, gaining speed. James's fingers instinctively gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, a subtle knot forming in his stomach. He didn't speed. His taillights weren't broken. There was no reason for this officer to be following him. He wasn't breaking any laws, or so he thought. Yet the patrol car stayed close behind him, tailing him in the rearview mirror, like a shadow hovering in a way that felt off. The feeling in his gut deepened. James made a mental note to remain calm. He reduced his speed, giving the officer a chance to pass him if that was indeed what was happening. But no, the patrol car stayed right there, trailing him closer than before. He knew this game well, but this time it felt different. A subtle dread hung in the air. Just as James thought he might be imagining things, the officer turned on the sirens. The sudden sharp wail sent a shiver down his spine. "All right," James muttered to himself, sighing. "No big deal, nothing to worry about. Just a routine stop. Maybe he's just checking the tags. I've got nothing to hide." He was used to this by now. He had been stopped plenty of times in his life for no other reason than the color of his skin and the car he drove. And while some stops had been polite, others had been anything but. Still, James knew better than to make waves. He kept his hands steady on the wheel, turned on his right turn signal, and guided his SUV toward the shoulder of the road, pulling over slowly. The gravel crunched under the tires as James came to a complete stop. His mind ran through the usual checklist: license and registration. In order, insurance check. Calm, measured movements. He could handle this. He always did. When the patrol car came to a halt behind him, the deputy stepped out, boots heavy against the gravel as he made his way toward James' vehicle. The officer's posture was stiff, rigid, as though he was already on guard. There was no friendliness in his step, no casualness, just a sense of authority that James had seen far too often in his life. As the deputy approached, James couldn't help but notice the subtle arrogance in the officer's gait. It wasn't the stance of a man simply doing his job. This was someone who believed they were in control, someone who expected deference. The officer's name was Harold Manson, and his approach was deliberate. He didn't smile, didn't offer any pleasantries. He just stared at James through the rolled-down window, his gaze sharp, almost like he was trying to assess James in a way that went beyond the usual traffic stop. His eyes flicked on over the vehicle, expensive, clean, sleek, then moved back to James, scrutinizing him as if trying to find something that wasn't there. James wasn't one to back down, but he knew the drill. He kept his voice steady, calm. "Good evening, officer," he said, his tone deep, but even. He didn't want to provoke anything. His demeanor was peaceful, collected. It had to be. Manson didn't acknowledge the greeting. Instead, he started with a question that felt loaded with judgment. "What are you doing driving around in this car, Mr. Franklin?" James blinked momentarily, taken aback. What was this? He had never had a cop address him like that before, but he didn't let the question rattle him. "Just headed home," he said simply. "Spent the weekend visiting family." "Family?" Manson repeated, his voice tinged with suspicion. "What family? What's a man like you doing in a car like this, on a road like this?" It wasn't the question that unsettled James, but the way Manson asked it. It wasn't a routine inquiry about his destination. It wasn't even about the car. It was about something else. The officer's words dripped with an unspoken assumption. It wasn't curiosity, it was skepticism, and it was all about James being out of place. James could feel his heart rate pick up. He took a slow, controlled breath, resisting the urge to defend himself. He wasn't in the mood for a confrontation, but Manson's tone was unprofessional, dismissive. This wasn't just about him breaking the law. It was about the way he looked, the way he lived, the assumptions that others made about him. Just visiting family, James replied, his voice unwavering. Manson's eyes narrowed clearly, not satisfied with the answer. And where's this family of yours, he pressed, still not acknowledging the peace James had maintained. He seemed to have a goal, a point to make. Greenville, James answered. It's a long drive back, but it's just me today. Quiet ride, Manson scoffed almost too audibly, as though the notion of James Franklin simply being a man going home didn't sit well with him. So you always drive this kind of car? Manson asked a question that wasn't really a question at all. It was an accusation wrapped in a thin veneer of inquiry. James held his gaze, no expression on his face. What's the issue with the car, officer, he asked. Oh, nothing, Manson said with a sly grin that didn't reach his eyes. We've been having a lot of issues on this road lately. Carjackings, drug runners. You understand how it is, don't you? I'm listening, James replied, keeping his voice neutral. Manson stepped back, a crooked smile forming on his lips. We do things differently down here, Mr. Franklin. James stiffened. It wasn't the words so much as the way they were delivered, laced with an implicit threat. James had seen this type of man before, the officer who felt entitled, who had a penchant for exerting control, for making assumptions based on the color of a man's skin, the car he drove, and the clothes he wore. I've complied with every instruction, James replied, his calm voice cutting through the officer's bravado. If I'm not being detained or arrested, I believe I am free to go. Manson's jaw tightened, and for a moment there was a brief silence. The deputy stepped closer. Too close, his hand lingered near his holster, as if it was a reflex, but James didn't flinch. He stood his ground, aware of the dangerous tension in the air. Manson's voice dropped to a threatening tone. I don't think you understand what I'm saying, Mr. Franklin, he spat almost gleefully. A car like yours on a road like this, with a driver like you, that's suspicious. James' voice stayed calm, though his heart beat faster now. I was born in Mississippi, deputy, he said, his words sharp as a knife. And last time I checked, the Constitution didn't have a zip code. The silence between them was palpable, thick with unspoken tension. Manson's face darkened, and for a split second, James could see the officer's ego bristle. This wasn't just about a traffic stop. This was personal. And in that moment, James Franklin knew that what was supposed to be a routine stop, what should have been nothing more than a polite exchange, was going to change the trajectory of his life. But James wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The conflict was about to escalate, and James Franklin was about to show the world what it meant to stand up against a system that tried to break him. Stay tuned. This was only the beginning. The tension between James Franklin and Deputy Manson thickened with every passing second. Manson, seemingly emboldened by his authority, had begun to push boundaries. He was no stranger to traffic stops or the subtle power games that often followed. But this was different. The encounter was no longer about checking documents or confirming the car's registration. No, this was about something deeper, something that simmered beneath the surface, a desire to assert control over James. It was a move designed to provoke, to challenge James' patience, and to test whether or not he would comply, as if his compliance would somehow justify Manson's unreasonable assumptions. James could feel the officer's gaze on him, weighing him up, measuring his every response as though he were something to be dissected. But instead of allowing the situation to unravel, James stayed calm, keeping his thoughts sharp and his demeanor steady. Manson's first question wasn't one that should have been asked at all. His voice carried a subtle edge, as though he had already decided what he wanted to hear. Do you always drive a car like this, Mr. Franklin? The question felt off, not just in its tone, but in its very nature. James raised an eyebrow at the officer, who was standing tall, with arms crossed, scrutinizing him as if he was trying to decipher a puzzle. It wasn't a simple inquiry into the car's make or model. It was an insinuation, a judgment, wrapped up in a question. James didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he responded, his voice deep and smooth, betraying no sign of irritation. I'm just on my way home. Officer, nothing special about that. His calm reply didn't seem to satisfy Manson, who clearly wasn't expecting such an even-tempered response. The officer's expression tightened. He didn't stop there. The questions came like a wave, one after another, each more invasive than the last. Where do you come from, Manson asked. What business do you have in this area? You've been here before. James remained silent for a moment, letting the words settle in the air. He knew where this was heading. This was no longer a simple stop for a routine check. Manson was trying to dig for something, anything that could justify his own unwarranted suspicion. "Just visiting family," James said calmly, leaning back slightly in his seat. He didn't owe the officer any more than that. He wasn't obligated to justify his life choices. But Manson wasn't done. "And is this the kind of car you drive when you go to see them?" The question felt more personal than it needed to be, and the underlying tone seemed to suggest that James' presence here, his car, his clothes, his very being, was somehow out of place. "Do you always ask people where they're going?" James replied, his voice unwavering. He had learned long ago how to handle men like Manson, those who tried to assert dominance without cause, those who used their authority to make others feel small. The officer's lips curled into a tight smile, but it wasn't one that made James feel at ease. Manson stepped back, giving James a quick once-over, as if inspecting him, more like an object than a person. His eyes lingered on the suit James was wearing. Polished leather shoes, a crisp navy blazer, a pressed white shirt. It was as if Manson was trying to decide whether James looked suspicious enough to warrant further investigation. Without warning, Manson gestured toward the back of the SUV. "Open your trunk," he said almost lazily, as if it were the most normal request in the world. James' brow furrowed and his fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Something about this whole situation didn't sit right. The officer was crossing lines now, testing his patience, trying to see just how far James would go along with this game. "No," James replied quietly but firmly, his eyes locking with Manson's. "I will cooperate, but you need to have a legal reason for that request." Manson's smile faded and he took a step closer, his hand brushing near his holster. The air between them grew heavy, thick with the simmering tension James could feel. Manson's eyes on him, sizing him up, daring him to back down, to give in to the pressure. "Are you refusing to comply, Mr. Franklin?" Manson's voice was colder now, more forceful. There was no civility left in his tone, just an underlying threat, a challenge wrapped in his words. James's heart rate remained steady, his pulse unflinching. He had seen this before, the subtle coercion, the unspoken assumption that people like him were meant to yield. But he wasn't going to play by Manson's rules. "Not this time. I'm not refusing anything, officer, but if you don't have a reason, I'm not opening my trunk." There was a moment of silence and then Manson stepped back slightly as though considering his next move. James didn't flinch, didn't look away. He stood his ground. The officer's face tightened, his patience wearing thin. This wasn't a simple matter anymore. He had expected James to comply without question, to bow to his authority. But James wasn't about to make things easy. He was tired of being treated like he had no right to exist in the spaces he occupied, tired of being judged by the color of his skin, the car he drove, and the way he carried himself. But Manson wasn't finished with him. "Listen, Mr. Franklin," Manson said with a sneer. "We've had issues with carjackings, drugs running through this area. And you look like the kind of guy who'd fit right in with that crowd." The words stung, but James didn't show it. He had dealt with this kind of profiling his entire life, the assumptions, the unfair judgments, but he wasn't going to let Manson have the satisfaction of seeing him react. "I'm not interested in what I look like," Officer James responded, his voice steady. "If you have no reason to hold me, then I'll be on my way." But Manson wasn't willing to let it go. "If you're so innocent, then you won't mind if I check your car. It's just procedure." James didn't move a muscle. The challenge was clear. He had to decide now. Would he stand up to this officer, or would he let the power dynamics define him? "I'll cooperate, but you'll need to have probable cause. Otherwise, I'm free to go." Manson's eyes narrowed as he stared at James. The deputy didn't like being questioned, didn't like being told what he could or couldn't do. But James wasn't about to back down. Not this time, not ever again. The standoff between them was only just beginning, and James knew that this moment would mark a turning point in his life. The tension was thick, almost palpable, as James Franklin stood outside of his SUV, trying to make sense of what had just unfolded. Officer Harold Manson had made it clear this wasn't about following the law anymore. This wasn't a simple traffic stop. It was a calculated effort to assert power, to label James as something he wasn't, all based on assumptions and an insidious form of profiling. But Manson wasn't done. No, he needed to find something, anything, to justify the stop, to reinforce the narrative he was trying to spin. But what Manson didn't count on was James's calm demeanor, the unshakable foundation of years of experience and survival. James wasn't going to make it easy for Manson. He wasn't going to be intimidated or coerced into giving up his rights. Manson's first tactic was simple: search the car. There were no drugs, no weapons, no signs of anything suspicious. James hadn't done anything wrong. He knew that, Manson knew that, but that didn't seem to matter. Manson's eyes narrowed with frustration as he rummaged through the vehicle opening compartments, rifling through the glove box, the center console, and under the seats. Every movement was laced with purpose, and yet there was nothing to be found. It was clear that Manson was losing patience. He needed a reason. He needed something to back up his suspicion, to justify his actions in the eyes of the law. But that was when it happened. A small plastic bag appeared seemingly out of nowhere. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a mistake. No, this was deliberate. With a quick motion, Manson slid the bag, a small, clear packet filled with a white powder, under the driver's seat, making sure to keep his movements discreet. The bag, now a piece of evidence, had been planted. It was a calculated move, a way to create a justification for arrest. And just like that, Manson believed he had his smoking gun. He stood up, puffing out his chest with a sense of pride, as though he'd just won some small victory. He turned toward the growing crowd, his voice booming with a false sense of triumph. "Well, well, well," he said, holding the bag high for all to see. "What do we have here? Looks like we found something after all." He looked at James, his grin widening, expecting a sense of victory, expecting James to crumble under the weight of his authority. But James didn't flinch, not even a twitch. Instead, James turned his gaze to the small bag, then back up at Manson. There was no fear in his eyes, only clarity. There was no panic in his stance, only control. "That's not mine," James said calmly, his voice steady as he looked directly at Manson, locking eyes with the officer. "You just planted that in my car." His words were like a challenge, like a warning to Manson. "You're about to make the biggest mistake of your career." For a moment, everything went silent. The crowd, which had been murmuring and filming with their phones, went still. The tension in the air shifted from confusion to realization. It wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It was an accusation, a power play, and James was calling it out. Manson's face faltered for the briefest of moments. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected James to be so calm, so unshaken in the face of what he thought was an easy victory. This wasn't how the game was supposed to play out. Manson had underestimated James in the worst way possible. The crowd that had gathered was no longer passive observers. They weren't just watching, they were documenting, recording every moment, every breath, every word, and they were starting to realize the truth. What was happening wasn't just a random event. It was a deeper systemic problem being exposed right in front of them. James, however, wasn't looking for sympathy. He wasn't asking anyone to believe him. He was simply stating the truth. The truth that Manson was desperately trying to hide behind lies and manipulation. Manson stepped closer, his hands shaking with anger. Now his fingers hovered near his holster, a clear sign of escalating tension. But James didn't back down. He didn't even flinch. "You think that tone is going to save you?" Manson sneered, his breath heavy with frustration. "No," James replied coolly, "but the truth might." James wasn't intimidated. He wasn't scared. He knew the stakes were high, but in that moment he realized something. This wasn't just a moment of defiance. It was the defining point of a much larger battle. And the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, was about to come to light with a smirk. Manson tried to regain control. "You're under arrest for possession of narcotics," he announced clearly, believing that this fabricated evidence would be enough to take James down. But as the words left Manson's mouth, a ripple of realization swept through the crowd. They weren't just witnessing a routine arrest. They were witnessing a miscarriage of justice, an officer abusing his power. And James, the man in the SUV, wasn't going to let it happen. The crowd began to react. A few voices shouted in protest, their words cutting through the charged atmosphere. "That man didn't do anything." One woman shouted, "We saw you plant that evidence." Manson turned, his face contorting with rage. "Step back or I'll arrest you for obstruction," he barked, but no one moved. The crowd stood firm, holding their phones higher, capturing every detail, every interaction. James wasn't about to let Manson dictate the narrative. He wasn't going to allow this officer's lies to go unchallenged. Trevor, the rookie officer who had been silently observing from the patrol car, felt a shift deep inside him. His mind raced. He couldn't ignore what he had just seen. He couldn't pretend that everything was fine, that Manson's actions were justified. He had been trained to follow orders, to uphold the law, but what he had just witnessed felt wrong on every level. He opened his mouth to speak, his voice shaky but firm. "Sir, I saw what you did. I saw you plant that bag." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Time slowed as the weight of Trevor's words sank in. Manson's eyes flashed with fury, but there was nothing he could do to erase the truth now. It had been said, it had been seen. This wasn't just about James Franklin anymore. It was about something larger, something systemic. The crowd began to buzz with excitement. Their phones still raised, their cameras still rolling. The truth was coming to light, and there was no going back. In the distance, sirens wailed. Backup was on the way. Manson had made his move, but the world was about to witness the consequences of his actions. James Franklin's calm defiance had set a chain of events in motion that neither he nor Manson could control. The truth was being exposed for all to see, and there was no way to undo it now. The story wasn't over yet. In fact, this was only the beginning. Stay tuned. It didn't take long for the word to spread. What started as a routine traffic stop had quickly escalated into a moment of seismic significance. The crowd that had gathered on the side of the road had begun as a few curious onlookers, but it soon swelled into something much larger. An energized, charged group of people, all bound together by one shared thing, the pursuit of truth. As the police officers continued their standoff with James Franklin, the crowd's presence became more than just a passive observation. It was a living, breathing force. Phones were raised, recording every second of the interaction. The scene was no longer just an isolated incident. It was becoming a rallying cry, a collective stand against injustice. James was no longer just fighting for his own rights. He had unknowingly become the symbol for a movement, a beacon for those who had long been oppressed and silenced. The weight of what was happening in that moment was beginning to sink in, not only for James, but also for those watching. They were witnessing an act of courage, but they were also recognizing something far deeper, a collective truth that had been hidden for too long. The movement was small at first, but with every phone camera capturing the moment, with every whisper of support among the onlookers, it was growing. James had become a symbol not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been mistreated or overlooked by the very systems meant to protect them. And with each passing minute, this spark of rebellion began to burn, brighter, hotter. The longer the scene dragged on, the more the crowd realized this wasn't just about a single traffic stop. This was a symptom of a much larger, more systemic issue. People began to speak out. A voice here, another there, the whispers grew into shouts. "We saw what you did," shouted one bystander. "This isn't right," another called out. The energy was contagious, spreading like wildfire. The crowd began to swell their anger, fueled by a sense of injustice that had long been ignored. And then amidst the crowd, there was a figure who couldn't stay silent any longer. Michael Reed, a young officer who had just graduated from the academy, stood in the back, observing the scene unfold. His hands shook with the tension in the air, and his heart raced as he watched his colleague, Officer Manson, continue to escalate the situation with James. Michael had been raised with ideals of justice, respect, and integrity. He had entered law enforcement with the belief that he could make a difference, that he could help people. But what he was witnessing right now felt like a betrayal. Officer Manson was using his power to manipulate a situation to fabricate evidence. It was something that Michael had been trained to believe was wrong, something that he had sworn an oath to fight against. And yet there he was, watching it happen in real time. The more he watched, the more Michael felt the weight of his conscience pressing down on him. He knew what he was seeing wasn't right. He knew it wasn't just a bad situation. It was a betrayal of everything law enforcement was supposed to stand for. The pressure inside him built until he could no longer stand idly by. His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly took a step forward, his legs feeling like lead. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, but it wasn't their gaze he feared. It was the judgment of his colleagues, his friends, that made his stomach twist. Could he do it? Could he risk everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, to speak up? The truth hung in the air, a heavy and undeniable presence. James Michael called out, his voice shaking with uncertainty, but loud enough for the crowd to hear. I saw it. I saw what he did. The bag? It wasn't there before. He planted it. The crowd gasped, the energy shifting from curiosity to a powerful surge of solidarity. James, standing calm and resolute in the face of his accuser, turned his gaze to Michael. There was no fear in James' eyes, only recognition. Michael had chosen to stand with the truth, to stand with him. James offered a nod of acknowledgement, a silent thank you for the courage Michael had just shown. But Manson, hearing Michael's words, was not prepared for the consequences of his actions. His face turned red with rage, his eyes narrowing as he took a step toward Michael. The crowd, sensing the shift in the air, instinctively took a step back. There was an unspoken understanding that the situation was now more dangerous than ever. Manson's voice rang out with venom. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Reed," he spat, his eyes flashing with a fury that was almost animalistic. "You think you're going to ruin my career over one mistake? You're no better than him." Michael stood his ground despite the tremble in his voice. "I don't care about your career. This isn't about you. It's about doing the right thing, and what you did wasn't right." The crowd was silent for a moment, absorbing Michael's words, then someone started to clap. A single clap followed by another, until the entire crowd erupted in a chorus of applause, their phones still recording their voices, now a powerful, unified force. James didn't smile. He didn't need to. He knew that this wasn't a victory yet, but it was a step forward. It was the moment the dam had broken, and now there was no going back. What had once been a quiet act of resistance was now a public, undeniable truth. Michael Reed had taken the first step. He had made the choice to stand for what was right, even when it meant risking his career, his friendships, and everything he had worked for. His actions would set the stage for the next chapter in this fight for justice, one that was only beginning to unfold. As the sirens wailed in the distance and backup arrived, the world seemed to slow down. There was no applause, no wild celebrations, just a quiet realization that something important had just happened. The truth was out, and now the world would watch as the repercussions of that truth began to reverberate across the system. But for James Franklin, this was just the beginning. The spark had been lit. Now the fire would spread. Stay tuned. A few days after the shocking incident, the reverberations were felt far beyond the quiet roadside where James Franklin's life had taken an unexpected turn. The event had spread like wildfire, igniting the conversation not just locally, but across the entire state. News outlets were ablaze with the story of the elderly black man wrongfully targeted by a corrupt officer, and the internet was flooded with footage from bystanders who had captured every shocking moment on their phones. What had started as a routine traffic stop had become a full-scale investigation, and the public demanded answers. The pressure was mounting, and it wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about a broken system that had been allowed to operate unchecked for too long. Officer Harold Manson found himself at the center of the storm. What seemed like a simple mistake on his part, planting evidence in a man's vehicle, was quickly turning into a much larger scandal. The internal investigation into his conduct was swift and unforgiving. He was confronted with an array of serious charges: abuse of power, falsifying evidence, and excessive use of force. His once promising career now hung in the balance as the truth came to light. The accusations were damning, and Manson was beginning to understand the gravity of his actions. What he had thought was a small and consequential choice, a quick fix to a situation he couldn't handle, had now turned into a nightmare. His colleagues were starting to distance themselves, and the internal department investigations were intensifying. For James Franklin, this moment was bittersweet. On one hand, he had become a symbol of resistance, the embodiment of standing up against injustice. But on the other, he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been wronged by a system that had ignored their pleas for justice. The investigation into Manson's actions quickly became a national story, drawing attention from civil rights organizations, social justice advocates, and legal experts alike. The spotlight was now on the department as a whole, an institution that had allowed officers like Manson to operate without accountability for far too long. The public outcry was deafening. Every new detail that emerged made the story more explosive. James didn't just want justice for himself. He wanted it for everyone who had suffered at the hands of a corrupt system. With his calm, unwavering strength, he became the face of a larger movement, a movement demanding an overhaul of the police system, accountability for every officer who had crossed the line, and a reckoning for those who had gotten away with abuse for far too long. His fight was no longer just personal. He wasn't fighting just for his own name to be cleared. He was fighting for a future where such abuses would no longer be tolerated. The fight for justice had taken on a new meaning, and James had become its torchbearer. Days after the investigation began, the city was alive with protests, calls for reform, and demands for accountability. The public response was undeniable. James Franklin's story had sparked something in people, a deep sense of righteous anger, but also a fierce desire for change. People weren't just speaking about his situation, they were speaking about their own experiences, their own battles with the system, their own frustrations with a system that had repeatedly failed them. James, who had once been content with a quiet life, had now become a key figure in this growing movement. He had no illusions about the challenges ahead. He knew that the road to justice was not a straight one, it was fraught with obstacles, setbacks, and opposition. But his resolve was unshakable. As the world turned its eyes toward him, he knew that he had to stand firm, not just for his own sake, but for all the people who had been silenced for far too long. He wasn't in this fight alone. The community stood with him, their voices growing louder each day. With every protest, every petition, every demonstration, the call for justice was becoming impossible to ignore. It was no longer just about one man's wrongful arrest. It was about holding the entire system accountable for the wrongs it had allowed to happen for decades. As the investigation into Manson gained momentum, the pressure on the department intensified. Internal audits were launched, and officers who had been complicit in covering up Manson's actions found themselves under scrutiny. The wheels of justice, while slow, were beginning to turn, but the opposition was fierce. In the halls of the police department, there were murmurs of dissent. Not everyone was happy about the scrutiny. Some officers saw the growing movement as an attack on their entire profession. They rallied behind Manson, blaming the media, the protesters, and the so-called anti-police sentiment for the downfall of one of their own. But this sentiment was quickly overshadowed by the growing support for James. His message resonated with many, especially those who had long felt disenfranchised by a system that had turned a blind eye to the abuses happening every day. The momentum continued to build as more and more voices joined the call for reform. In the midst of it all, James remained calm, steady, and focused. He knew that his battle wasn't over and that the fight for justice required more than just a single victory. It required systemic change. His courage in the face of such adversity had inspired so many, and it had ignited a fire within them. The spark had been lit, and now it was time to see if the flames of reform could truly transform the system that had allowed such abuses to fester for so long. Meanwhile, Manson's fate was sealed as the investigation dug deeper into his past actions. As more details emerged about his history of misconduct, the public's anger grew. The department couldn't sweep his behavior under the rug any longer. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. But for James, the fight had only just begun. He knew that the charges against Manson were just the first step in a much larger battle. The system that had allowed Manson's actions to go unchecked for so long was just as guilty as he was. And now James was determined to see it all exposed, no matter what it took. The courtroom battles were yet to come, but James was already thinking ahead. His focus had shifted from simply clearing his name to dismantling the structures that allowed men like Manson to operate with impunity. And with the world watching, James Franklin was prepared to fight with everything he had, not just for himself, but for the future of justice. As the dust began to settle after Harold Manson's suspension, James Franklin could almost feel the weight of victory in the air. The system had been shaken to its core, and for a brief moment it seemed like justice was within reach. However, the reality was far from over. The battle James had started was far from complete. What followed would test his strength, his resolve, and his belief in the power of justice. While the immediate victory of exposing Manson's actions was significant, the people behind the scenes, the ones who had been protecting Manson and other corrupt officers, weren't going to let things end so easily. There were forces at work that sought to undermine everything James had fought for. The resistance came in many forms: threats, intimidation, and most disturbingly, acts of violence aimed at silencing the voices that were finally beginning to be heard. One late evening, as James was returning home after another long day of interviews and meetings with civil rights leaders, he was ambushed by a group of masked assailants. They were quick, calculated, and ruthless. Their purpose clear: to strike fear into James, to remind him that his fight wasn't welcomed by everyone. But as the attackers closed in on him, something extraordinary happened. A car screeched to a halt near James, and before he could even react, a figure emerged from the vehicle. It was none other than Michael Reed, the young officer who had once been a mere spectator during the confrontation with Manson. The same man who had been so unsure about standing up for justice when the truth first emerged. But this time, Michael wasn't hesitating. This time, he was ready. Without a word, Michael rushed toward the assailants, brandishing a gun, his hands steady, but his eyes full of determination. He fired a warning shot into the air, causing the attackers to freeze. The tension in the air was palpable, and for a moment it seemed like time itself had stopped. The attackers, realizing they were no match for Michael, scattered into the darkness, leaving James unharmed but shaken. Michael reached James, his breath heavy, eyes wide with adrenaline. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Though there was no mistaking the sense of urgency in his tone, James, still in disbelief at the turn of events, nodded slowly, his heart still racing. "I'm fine," he said. "But you? What are you doing here?" Michael looked down, a mix of guilt and pride crossing his face. "I couldn't just stand by anymore, James. I had to do something. I had to do the right thing. I wasn't sure how to fight. But I know now you didn't ask for this. But I'm here fighting with you." For James, the moment was both humbling and transformative. The young man who had once stood on the sidelines, too afraid to speak up, had now become an active part of the movement for justice. Michael had crossed a line that many others had failed to. He had chosen truth over silence, and in doing so he had proven that standing up for what's right was more important than loyalty to a broken system. But the challenges didn't stop with this newfound alliance. As the weeks went by, the tension continued to build. The community that had rallied around James and the cause of justice faced an uphill battle. The opposition was still strong, and those who had been complicit in protecting officers like Manson were now fighting back, though not with words. They sought to undermine James's credibility, to tarnish his reputation, and to silence the growing movement that had begun to gain traction. One of the most powerful ways they did this was through fear. Anonymous threats began to flood James's life, each one more menacing than the last. His home was vandalized, his car keyed, and he received numerous messages warning him to back off before things got worse. But James didn't falter. If anything, the threats only made him more determined to push forward. The people who had stood behind him, his supporters, the activists, and the community leaders, were not backing down either. They knew that this wasn't just about one man. It was about the systemic corruption that had plagued law enforcement for decades. They knew that the only way to defeat that corruption was not to retreat in the face of fear, but to confront it head on. James's journey was no longer just about one isolated case of injustice. It was about building a foundation for lasting change. The struggle had shifted from fighting against one bad officer to dismantling the structures that allowed such abuses to thrive. Every day, James was faced with a new challenge: more resistance, more personal attacks, and more attempts to discredit the movement. But through it all, he remained steadfast in his mission. And as the attacks on James escalated, so did the support from unexpected places. Michael Reed, who had once been just another officer trying to navigate a corrupt system, was now working alongside James in ways he hadn't imagined. They spent hours together strategizing, organizing, and planning the next steps for the movement. Michael knew that what they were doing wasn't just about one case, it was about reforming an entire system. The transformation was profound. Michael had gone from being a young rookie officer, hesitant and unsure, to being an active ally in the fight for justice. He had witnessed firsthand the power of truth, and he knew that now was the time to use that truth to build something better. Together, James and Michael became a force to be reckoned with, two men from different walks of life, but united in their resolve to make the world a better place for everyone, regardless of race, background, or status. Yet the personal risks were high. As the movement gained momentum, the attacks on James and those close to him only intensified. His family was threatened. His allies were targeted, and those who had once supported the cause began to feel the pressure. But James stood firm, and with every new challenge, he grew more determined. But the true test was yet to come. The road ahead was fraught with even more obstacles. As they took their fight from the streets to the courts, the risks escalated. The legal battles would be long and grueling. But James knew that this was the only way to truly affect change. If they could hold those in power accountable, they would prove that no one was above the law, no matter their badge, no matter their position. And as the movement grew, so did the stakes. James and Michael had taken the first steps towards something bigger than themselves. They weren't just fighting for justice for James Franklin. They were fighting for the future, for the generations that would come after them. They were fighting for a society where truth wasn't silenced, where justice wasn't a privilege, but a right for all. This was just the beginning. The fight for justice had taken a new turn, and the road ahead would be long. But James Franklin wasn't walking it alone, and the future, though uncertain, looked brighter with each step they took. The news of James Franklin's victory spread quickly far beyond the confines of his hometown. What began as a solitary stand against injustice had ignited a flame that set the entire nation alight. James was no longer just a man fighting for his own rights. He had become a symbol of resilience, courage, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. And as the days passed, he found himself at the forefront of a movement that was bigger than any one person. It was a movement that sought to rewrite the very fabric of American law enforcement and to confront a deep-seated history of inequality that had plagued the country for generations. The turning point came when James, along with his allies, launched the Brooks Act. This law became the cornerstone of their fight, demanding that police officers wear body cameras during traffic stops and interactions with the public. It also called for an independent body of citizens to oversee law enforcement actions, ensuring that no one, regardless of their badge, was above the law. The Brooks Act was not just a piece of legislation, it was a revolution in the making. It represented the hope of thousands of individuals who had been mistreated by law enforcement, whose voices had been silenced for far too long. It symbolized the belief that a broken system could be fixed and that accountability was not just a privilege, but a fundamental right. For James, the battle wasn't about a single officer or one instance of misconduct. It was about systemic change, transforming an entire institution to serve all people equally, fairly, and justly. As the bill began to gain traction, it faced fierce opposition from certain factions within the law enforcement community and from political figures who feared the ripple effects it might have on their power. They argued that the bill would make it harder for police to do their jobs, claiming it would lead to an increase in crime and a decrease in public safety. These voices came from the same people who had grown comfortable with the status quo, who had benefited from the silence of those who had been too afraid to speak out. But James and his supporters were undeterred. They understood the cost of doing nothing. They knew that without accountability, without oversight, the same patterns of abuse and oppression would continue. They knew that their fight was not just about securing justice for themselves. It was about creating a future where no one would have to endure the same injustices that had haunted James and countless others. The country watched as the Brooks Act moved through the halls of government. Protesters took to the streets, organized marches, and gathered at town halls. People from all walks of life, from urban cities to small rural towns, rallied in support of the bill. The movement was growing stronger every day, fueled by the shared belief that it was time for change. It wasn't just about one bad officer. It was about the collective responsibility of society to ensure that all individuals, regardless of their race background or socioeconomic status, were treated with dignity and respect. The media also played a pivotal role in amplifying the voices of those who had been ignored for so long. The coverage of the Brooks Act, along with the story of James Franklin's courageous stand, brought attention to the plight of marginalized communities who had long been victimized by discriminatory policing practices. News outlets, once hesitant to cover such sensitive topics, were now forced to reckon with the reality of police misconduct, systemic racism, and the call for reform. And yet, despite the overwhelming support for the bill, the opposition remained fierce. Behind closed doors, powerful figures within law enforcement and politics worked tirelessly to discredit the movement, to undermine the progress that had been made. They spread misinformation. They sowed seeds of doubt, and they tried to paint James and his supporters as radicals seeking to dismantle the very fabric of American society. But the more they attacked, the more resolute James became. And he knew that this fight wasn't just about laws and policies, it was about the people. The faces of those who had suffered. The mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters who had lived in fear every time they were stopped by a police officer. The elderly individuals who had been unjustly targeted because of their race. The young people who had grown up in communities where the police were seen as the enemy rather than protectors. James wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for all of them. The culmination of all their hard work, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication came when the Brooks Act was officially signed into law. The celebrations were bittersweet. While James felt a sense of accomplishment, he knew the work wasn't done. This was just the beginning. The passage of the Brooks Act was a monumental victory, but it was only the first step in a long journey toward a more just society. In the aftermath, James Franklin continued to be a voice for change. He traveled across the country, speaking at rallies, town halls, and community events. He met with lawmakers advocating for further reforms and pushing for stronger measures to hold law enforcement accountable. He was a tireless champion for the voiceless, and his message was clear. Justice wasn't a one-time event. It was an ongoing struggle that required constant vigilance, participation, and action. Through all the trials, setbacks, and moments of doubt, James had never lost sight of what mattered. He remained humble, focused on the goal of creating a system where everyone, regardless of race or background, could feel safe and protected by the law. He had become a symbol, not just of resistance, but of resilience. A man who had fought back against the system and won, and who had inspired an entire nation to stand up and demand more. As the years went by, the ripple effects of the Brooks Act were felt across the country. Police departments began to implement body cameras, and citizen oversight boards were established in cities and towns nationwide. The public's relationship with law enforcement slowly began to shift. Trust was being rebuilt, not through empty promises or superficial reforms, but through real meaningful changes in the way police interacted with the communities they served. James Franklin's story became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, change was possible. It was a testament to the power of one person's determination to make a difference, and the enduring strength of a community that refused to be silenced. But for James, the work was never about accolades or recognition. It was about the knowledge that he had fought for something bigger than himself, something that would outlast him. He had done what was right, and in the process, he had changed the world. In the end, the Brooks Act wasn't just a piece of legislation. It was a promise. A promise that justice, though long delayed, would ultimately prevail. And as James looked back on his journey, he knew that his fight, along with the fight of countless others, had forever altered the course of history. The courtroom was filled with a sense of electric anticipation. James Franklin stood in the front row, his eyes unwavering as the judge prepared to deliver the final verdict. A long, torturous journey had brought him to this moment. The months of uncertainty, the danger, the personal sacrifices, all culminating in this singular moment of reckoning. The world outside the courthouse was holding its breath, waiting for the judgment that would seal the fate of Harold Manson. It wasn't just the fate of one man at stake. It was the fate of an entire system that had long been corrupted. James had become more than just a man on trial. He had become the embodiment of resistance, the voice of those who had been silenced for far too long. His actions, his refusal to remain passive, had lit a fire across the country. The fight for justice was no longer just a whisper. It had turned into a roar, a movement that couldn't be ignored. Manson, the once proud officer who had worn his badge with arrogance, sat across the room, visibly tense. He had been confident that he would escape the consequences of his actions. But as the days passed and the truth unraveled before him, that confidence began to erode. The mounting evidence against him, the tampered evidence, the witness testimonies, the damning footage left little room for doubt. His time was running out. As the judge rose to deliver the verdict, a hush fell over the room. James could feel the weight of the moment. His heart raced, but his composure remained steady. His thoughts drifted back to the countless times he had been wronged, to the systemic failures that had allowed officers like Manson to thrive unchecked. But he had made it this far against all odds. He had stood his ground, and now justice was finally within reach. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom, breaking the silence. Harold Manson, you are hereby found guilty of all charges, abuse of power, evidence tampering, false arrest, and obstruction of justice. You will serve time in prison for your actions. The words hit like a thunderclap. The room seemed to pause for a moment, as if time itself had stopped. But then a quiet ripple of relief spread through the crowd. Justice had prevailed. The system, though battered and bruised, had finally held one of his own accountable. Harold Manson, the man who had once wielded his badge with impunity, was now facing the consequences of his actions. James Franklin, standing tall with quiet dignity, felt the weight of the moment sink in. He didn't need to cheer, didn't need to bask in the glory of his victory. He had already won. This wasn't just about him. This was about every person who had ever been wronged by the system. This was about everyone who had ever been told that their voices didn't matter, that they weren't worthy of justice. Today, those voices had been heard, and James knew deep in his soul that he had played a crucial part in making that happen. As the courtroom emptied, James stood by the doors, surrounded by his friends, family, and supporters. But there was no overwhelming celebration, no parades or fanfare. For James, this moment was bittersweet. He had won, but the war for justice was far from over. There was still work to be done, still systems to be dismantled, still lives to be changed. Yet James was resolute. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. He knew there would be more fights to face, more resistance to overcome. But he had come this far, and nothing could stop him now. As he walked out of the courthouse, the warm sunlight hit his face. For a moment, he simply stood there, allowing the moment to wash over him. The streets were filled with people, both familiar faces and strangers who had followed his journey from the beginning. They weren't just celebrating the conviction of one officer. They were celebrating the birth of a movement that James had ignited with nothing more than his unwavering belief in what was right. His words echoed in his mind, the words that had guided him through this battle. The truth will always prevail, and we will be the ones who refuse to let the darkness consume the light. And as he looked around, seeing the faces of those who had stood by him, he knew that he hadn't just changed his own fate, he had changed the fate of a nation. This wasn't just about one man. This was about all of us, standing together, refusing to let injustice go unchallenged. The fight for justice was just beginning, but it had already been won. James Franklin had become a symbol not just of resistance, but of hope. His journey had shown that no matter how deep the corruption runs, no matter how powerful the forces that try to keep people down, the truth has a way of rising to the surface. The truth is powerful. It cannot be silenced. And it is in that truth that justice is found. For James, this victory wasn't about revenge. It was about building something better. He had taken on the system and he had won. But now his mission had evolved. It was no longer about one man or one victory. It was about creating a legacy that would endure long after the dust had settled. His fight was not just for himself, it was for everyone who had ever felt powerless, who had ever been forced to suffer in silence. As he walked away from the courthouse, James Franklin knew that his journey was far from over. The road ahead was still long, and the challenges were many, but with every step he took, he knew that he was not alone. He was carrying with him the strength of a nation that had finally awakened and was ready to fight for justice. The final verdict had been delivered. Harold Manson would serve time for his crimes, but the real victory wasn't just in that conviction. The real victory was the change that was already taking place. The real victory was in the hearts and minds of the people who had seen the truth, who had been inspired to take action, and who were now standing tall in the face of injustice. And so the story of James Franklin didn't end with one victory in a courtroom. It continued to unfold one step at a time as he and countless others worked to build a better, more just world. The truth had prevailed, and with it, a new dawn had broken. The fight for justice was far from over. But now more than ever, James knew that he was not fighting alone. The light had been kindled, and nothing could put it out. The legacy of James Franklin's journey would live on for generations to come. The Brooks Act had changed the landscape of American policing, but James had also ignited a fire that would burn for years, a fire fueled by truth, by justice, and by the belief that one person, one voice could truly make a difference. As James Franklin stepped into the future, he carried with him the knowledge that the battle for justice was never truly over. It was a battle that had to be fought every day by every person who believed in what was right. And as long as there were people like James Franklin, the fight would continue. Because justice, as James had learned, was not a destination. It was a journey, and one worth every step. And so, with the weight of history on his shoulders, James Franklin looked toward the horizon, knowing that the best was yet to come. The journey had only just begun. Never think you're too small to make a change, James Franklin emphasized in his final interview, his voice steady and resolute. Sometimes all it takes is one person who dares to speak up, and that's the voice of justice for everyone. His words hung in the air long after the interview was over. The message was simple but powerful. The power to create change doesn't lie in numbers or power. It's in the courage of individuals to stand up when it matters most. For James, that courage had led him through the darkest moments against systems designed to keep him silent and ultimately to victory. As he sat in the chair, his expression unwavering, James continued, "This fight isn't over, and it's not just my fight. It's the fight of anyone who believes in fairness, who believes that justice should be for all. We are all in this together. And together we can make a difference, no matter how hard the road ahead may seem." The camera zoomed in, capturing every word, as if the universe was listening too. James had become more than a symbol. He was a beacon of hope. The person who had dared to defy the odds, challenge the system, and ultimately lead a movement that reshaped the landscape of American justice. Now, as the story unfolds for you, the audience, it's time to reflect. What does this story mean for you? How has the journey of one man who dared to challenge authority shaped the way you see the world? Does it change the way you view justice, truth, and the responsibility each of us has to stand up? James Franklin's path has reached a conclusion, but the essence of his message, the power of standing tall in the face of adversity, endures. As you sit with this story, ask yourself, what can I do? Change often starts with small actions, but those small steps build momentum. Perhaps it's a question you ask, a truth you speak, or an injustice you refuse to ignore. Whatever it is, know this: you are not too small to make a difference. This story isn't just about a routine traffic stop gone wrong. It's about a battle for truth, a fight for justice, and a relentless push to hold the powerful accountable. Each twist and turn in the narrative serves as a reminder that change doesn't always come from grand gestures, but from the quiet, steady resolve of individuals willing to stand against what's wrong. And the journey is far from over. The work is never truly finished. But through the courage of people like James Franklin, the system begins to crack. His actions have ignited a fire that will burn for generations, inspiring countless others to speak up, demand accountability, and strive for a better world. What James proved above all is that one person can truly change the world, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Even when the world tells you to stay silent, you don't have to be a superhero or a political giant to make history. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to speak, to act, and to stand firm when others might falter. Now it's your turn. Do you see things differently now? Have James's actions inspired you to question what's right, or to take a step toward challenging injustices in your own life? Leave a comment and let us know what this story means to you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to follow us for more stories like this. Stories that inspire challenge and remind us that the fight for justice is never in vain. Thank you for being part of this journey. James Franklin's story will live on not just in books or headlines, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who dares to take a stand. The truth doesn't need permission to rise. It only needs people brave enough to carry it. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Remember, one action can change everything. Keep speaking up. Keep fighting for justice, and never underestimate the power of your voice.